Okay, welcome to segment one of Gender, Race, Class, and Work. Happy Martin Luther King Day. I'm in my office recording this. This is the first lecture for segment one, and I'm going to do a little bit of background stuff on class expectations, and then we'll talk about the lecture for segment one. So the way this is going to work, hopefully, is that you'll have a set of lecture notes that you can download in each segment. So your lecture notes should be already in segment one. I'll double check, but I don't see why they wouldn't be. And the idea is that in each set of lecture notes, there'll be a set of key terms that you should be familiar with. And then I will sort of bullet point out some key debates that you should be sort of mindful of, right? That are kind of the highlights of that reading. I'm not going to like go through each reading with you. You're more than capable. Most of you are juniors and seniors, but you're bright students. You're more than capable of reading the material and figuring out what it's about, but talking more about the big picture and what those debates are and why those readings were assigned is kind of the point of the lecture piece of this. And then also just, pulling out some of the key pieces of language that we should be talking about or that you may have questions about. And of course, if there's stuff that's not on the key term list and you have no idea what it's about, since we are doing this virtually, you should never hesitate to ask a question, either through an email, but I would really encourage you just to ask it through the discussion forums, because more likely than not, if you don't know the answer to it, somebody else doesn't know the answer to it either. So that's how we're going to do this. Any feedback that you might have on the video lecture is helpful. Other GLS classes, if you've taken them, have kind of a 10-page Word document lecture that you read. I find that kind of stiff and impersonal. So I thought, especially with a 300 level class like we have, that just sort of having some brief lecture notes that are a page or 2 page long that help you kind of guide through the reading, and then me kind of talking through some pieces of it, and then us talking through the rest of it in the discussion forum is a little bit more constructive and intellectually stimulating. So that's how we're going to do it. That's how it's going to fly. There's a lot to cover in each segment. There's a lot of reading. I get it. You guys have lots of classes. You should do all the reading. There will be some segments, I'm sure, where you don't get it all done, but I can tell, if you're just referencing one reading again and again, then clearly you've only made it through, a portion of the readings. Also, you have a textbook edited by Goodman. Please note that Goodman is not the author of everything in there. So when you're citing something in there or you're referencing it, for example, and in this first segment, you're reading section 2 of it, and there's 6 chapters. For example, Alice Kessler Harris wrote one piece of that. Don't tell me that Goodman wrote it. Like, don't cite Goodman page whatever. It's Alice Kessler Harris's piece. So just try to keep that in mind, and I'll remind folks as we go through. But the only piece that Goodman really writes is those introductory essays to each segment, right? So if you're citing something from the introductory essay, then that's Goodman. If you're citing something from one of the essays themselves that are edited down, because these are scholarly chapters or articles that have been edited down for your purposes for the textbook, then cite the name of the author, okay? Each segment is, a combination of readings, maybe some online references and tools, maybe a video. It's all kind of a mishmash. Throughout the course of the discussion forums, I'll also post additional pieces that I think are interesting that I may have heard in the news or read in the paper or seen on social media in some way, to kind of connect to what we're doing. A lot of, we're kind of taking this class at an exciting time, right? It's the midst of the primary season for the presidential election. Many of the topics that we will cover in this class may or may not show up in the presidential election cycle, and we can talk about that. Why is it that for example, especially around the family policies, around work and stuff, is this being talked about or is this not being talked about, and why not? When they talk about wages, and income, how is that being talked about and what's being excluded and included. That's all going to sort of help develop our discussion, and that'll be kind of fun too. So for the purposes of segment one, the point here really is to go over a little bit of an introduction. And I want you, we have three, each segment has 2 discussion forums. This one has 3. The discussion forum, the first one is just introductions and it's ungraded. So, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, but also, I was kind of trying to think about how to liven those up a little bit. And so what I'd like you to do, and this will be in the instructions as well, but when you introduce yourself, tell me 3 people, alive or dead, that you think it would be interesting to have a meal with, to share a meal with, and why. Why would you want to have a meal with these 3 people? So I'll go first, and I'll post it in my discussion forum, and you guys can read that. I'll post that a little bit later today. So the other 2 pieces is we have 2 discussion forums in this section. Topic 1 is what's at the center of the economy, workplace, or the household, and that's a debate. We're going to do a couple of debates. This is my first time doing this, so we'll see how it goes. Based on your last name, I got to double check what everybody's last name is, make sure that's an even breakdown. But the instructions will be, what should be at the center of the economy? Should it be the workplace, or should it be the household? And depending on what you've been assigned, you're going to have to make the case for that. Now, obviously, you could just try to debate that without having done the readings, but you're not going to do very well if you do that. So you need to read the readings first and then do the debate. And then the second discussion forum in this is definitions of inequality. How do we define inequality and equality? What do we mean by that? How do social and cultural, economic, political pieces all inform our social and our understanding of inequality and equality? What are our own prejudices coming into that, regardless of the color of our skin, our gender, our sex, our class? We all come to some place with biases, right? And potentially positions of power. And how does that inform our understanding of what inequality is? One of the things I do is I teach. I also teach labor union members. I teach adults. So, for example, this past weekend I taught a 4-hour labor history class to about 60 workers who work for. Who mostly do construction work around plumbing, water, concrete, that kind of thing. So, building trade workers. And just fascinating in a room of predominantly working class people, very diverse, age ranging from 24 up to the 50s, Black and white, Latino, men, women, some college, some no college, people's first jobs are, anything from golf cart caddy to fast food worker to grocery store to working on the streets, right? So everybody has all of these different backgrounds, and they all have very differing views of what inequality and equality means and how we get to a certain place and what people should do as individuals versus groups. There is, not one collective position on this, right? This is part of the challenge. All right, so this section predominantly takes us a little bit back, helping us to understand how we got to where we are today. So there's a list of themes. One of the highlights of this is I really want you to understand that when we think about the economy, we predominantly think about ways in which the economy grows, which means how is money funneled into our economy? And so how is it funneled into our economy, right? What are the different avenues money comes into the economy? Well, we're a consumer society, right? So money is funneled in through our consumption patterns. So we go out to eat, we spend money, we buy a car, we buy a house. All those things are consumer goods, right? Services and durable goods. So that puts money into the economy. Investments, Wall Street, all of that, right? The invisible hand of Wall Street, that puts money. Trade puts money in. Taxes, all of these things are have concrete amounts of money attached to them that put money into our economy. There are other ways in which our economy is built that often is very underrepresented, and that's unpaid labor. And that's something that I want to make sure we understand from the get-go, that unpaid labor also builds our economy, right? And there have been studies shown, and I'll post some links to this, but there are studies shown, right, that X amount of housework or unpaid labor contributes X amount to the gross domestic product of our economy, right? So just because you may not be, for example, your mom, I'm sure someone in our class will say your mom's a stay-at-home mom or was a stay-at-home mom up until the time you went to high school, maybe, or college. All of that labor that we do in the household, that stay-at-home mothers do, or that we do after hours when we're not working, all of that also contributes to the gross domestic product of our economy, right? Even though it doesn't accrue wages, and very significantly, right, not only does it not earn you a wage, but because so many of the benefits tied to our economic well-being, such as Social Security payments, unemployment insurance, all those things are also linked, right, to wages we earn. So, for example, if you have a stay-at-home mom, for example, or a parent who's been chronically underemployed, you may sit down with them and say, okay, so what do you think your Social Security payment is going to be at the time in which you're ready to collect on Social Security, compared to if you have a two-parent household where one's been working the majority of your life? Those pictures are going to look really different. Yet, does that mean that the labor of that person in your family who was doing the non-paid wage work, was that any less valuable, right, than the work that the paid wage earner was getting? And so what does that mean, right, if you're not earning that Social Security payment? That's, there was a decision made in our country in the 1930s to tie basically all of the social welfare benefit packages to wage labor. Yet at that time, you had less than 30% of women in our country working in wage earning jobs. What does that tell us? That tells us that the way in which our economy is structured, and still structured today, assumes that women in particular derive our economic security from a relationship with a wage earner, and historically that wage earner would be a man, right? Because up until this past Supreme Court decision legalizing gay marriage in our country, if you had what would be considered a two-parent household with same-sex parents, one being a wage earner, one not, you would not be eligible as the non-wage earner, right, to your partner's benefits. So we have set up an economic system for the family in which a woman is expected, right, to derive her financial security from her spouse. Yet we know, right, just from personal anecdotal experience, but also from our studies, that is not the standard household, nor has it been the standard household for a really long time, nor even when it was the dominant household. Why would we create a situation in which two adults, one would essentially be dependent on the other? But that was the reality up until now, but very much so up until the 1970s and early 80s, when women didn't even have the right to have a credit card in their own name, nor could they purchase a house in their own name. It is only during my generation, having been born in 1971, that there's been my generation is this opportunity, right, to be in theory independent of her partner, her spouse. So that's kind of the core of what we're going to try to understand a little bit in this reading. So we're going to look at the division of labor and how historians have talked about that in the Alice Kessler Harris piece. We're also going to talk about the Goodman readings all kind of deal with this issue of, I'm looking at my notes when I look down, what is inherently unequal and what is created unequal, right? Is there something that just is inherently unequal, and is that inevitable? Or do we create these environments of inequality, and how do we change that, right? So kind of think about that. And what do you assume is sort of inherently unequal, and what have you, but really in actuality is created this inequality? The other piece of this is, how does the construction of race and the institution of slavery sort of complicate and support the above arguments, right? When we think about an economy that has relied largely and still does on the legacy of slavery, right? And our understandings of slavery. And then also how has that played out from generation to generation in terms of the ability for those who are descendants of enslaved workers, right, to then carry on and have viable economic futures. And that's where the Rosigno reading on discrimination of African American men is really powerful, looking at the precarious historical legacy, right, of African American men and how slavery has basically impacted, right, even all these generations removed, the economic livelihood of African American families. What's the social construction of motherhood? I've already sort of dipped into that a little bit, but think about it, right? Think about what we understand about motherhood versus parenting, right? Think about if your own expectations as you age. For those of you who male or female plan on having children, what does that look like in your future? What do you imagine the scenario looking like? And then think about what is the social construction of that? Like how much you're being impacted by social expectations and norms, or limited by lack of public policies that support parenting and working. And then also, what are some of the traditional areas of women's work? That's something that we're going to look at in the readings today. Like what has been seen historically as women's labor? That's something that'll come up again and again and again. So take a look at that. And if it is historically women's labor, and there has been this inherent expectation, right, that women mother, and this gets back to the Sears lawsuit debate that you'll read about. One historian says that women didn't want better paying jobs. Therefore, Sears Corporation was not discriminatory in their practices, whereas Alice Kessler Harris argues that women have a right to advancement in any job, right? And therefore Sears was behaving discriminatorily in a discriminatory manner. So think about that, break that down. Maybe look in whether you know this about your family or you want to inquire. How many family members have worked in domestic service in your family? If you don't know, this might be a grandmother, a great grandmother. This might be someone in your family right now. An aunt, your mother, a sister. How does that impact your how does that impact your family history? How was the division of labor different before industrialization versus after it, right? Before industrialization, our economy was driven not so much by a consumer economy, but by a family economy. And because of that family economy, in some ways, work was not seen as unequal. It was just separate. Yet, the work may have been seen as sort of equally valuable in terms of supporting the family economy, yet women still existed in a place of coverture, right? What does coverture mean? Coverture means they're covered. Women were property, actual legal property. This is not like, it's rhetoric. They were actual legal property, right, of their husbands, first their fathers, right? And then until they married, then their husbands, right? So while their work in the home was in some ways perceived as equally valuable, right? The domestic labor versus agricultural labor in order to support a family economy, at the end of the day, who owned everything, right? Not the woman, right? Because she didn't have a legal right to own everything. So in order to at least feel equal, you had to have a spouse that was gonna kind of support that. But in reality, politically, socially, economically, culturally, completely unequal, right? So how does that change over time? Jacqueline Jones writes, Black attempts to maintain the integrity of family life amounted to a political act, and herein lies a central irony in the history of slave women. What does Jones mean by that exactly? What is she trying to get at there? Why would attempting to maintain a family life, often a family life that mimicked a family life that was inherently unequal, right? If we're talking about coverture, where a woman has less power than her husband. Why is that a political act? And how is that ironic? Why is that ironic? What is she trying to get at there? And then, so there's some other discussions around there, but I guess the final two pieces, going back to the discrimination in African American men chapter, how do African American men experience harassment and discrimination in the workplace? What does that look like? And how do cultural stereotypes impact the work experience of African American men? What is it? How are you limited, and how is this? And have we seen, just anecdotally, this is obviously based just on your own personal reading and what you've taken in classes and what you read in the paper and what you see on social media, do you think this has changed significantly over the past 2 years with the increased attention and what seems to be increased rates of police violence in African American communities, right? So that gives a little bit of a background on what I want, the points I want you to highlight in these readings, and we'll go into more detail in the discussion forums, and I'll draw it out a little bit more. And again, if there's some piece of this that you don't understand, please pose a question in the discussion forums, because that's the place where we'll kind of like, and you pose it to me certainly, but pose it to your colleagues as well, because you all are smart students and have taken different kinds of classes. We have a really interesting, diverse mix of backgrounds in terms of majors. So I think everybody's going to have an interesting set of readings. But also, please remember, if you've taken a class like this that kind of touches on a lot of these topics, it doesn't count to cite the readings from a class you took 2 semesters ago and say, oh, well, in this class I read about this, blah, 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 and not be citing the readings for this class. That's sort of double dipping, and that doesn't count. So you will be graded down for that. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to wrap it up, post this, and post my introduction in the discussion forum. Class starts tomorrow. This segment runs from January 19th to January 29th. You will be expected to sign up by January 29th, which is the end of this segment, for an in-class presentation for your Pinterest assignment. All of those instructions are listed under assignments. And you also need to take the class process test by February 5th. So be sure to do that as well. Take care.